Okay, setting up the meeting for Facebook Live, and we are live.
Excellent.
We can go ahead and get started.
Okay, Doc, can you still hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay, excellent. All righty, so I want to welcome everyone out there to our part 2 of our discussion with Black Center directors, looking at listening to their perspectives on what the world looks like, higher ed, K-12, subsequent to all of our flurry around COVID-19. So today we have assembled 3 brilliant scholars, Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher, Dr. Tia Lon Dancy, and Dr. Jelando Jackson. And we are going to dive in today, get their perspectives on not only what's going on out there in the world of K-12 and higher ed, but also in our communities of color. And I thought that these scholars would be best positioned to talk about, given the fact that their research focuses on underrepresented communities, fragile communities, and we just want to hear and get their perspectives. So we're going to step through a series of questions today. And we also have opportunities for you to chime in with your questions, add those to the comments section. And subsequent to our discussion today, we'll actually go back, respond to those questions. And at the very end, we'll also have, we'll give the center directors opportunities to give you contact information of how to best reach out to them and to engage with them for further discussions. But with all that said, let's just dive in. So the very first question that I have for you scholars today, if we look at the research of Given 2008, Given states that counter narratives in their broadest formulation are stories, narratives that splinter widely accepted truths about people, cultures, and institutions. So with that said, given that the focus of this town hall is on counter narratives, share with us, what is your counter narrative?
I'll share two. Sorry about that. I'll share 2 thoughts. The first counter narrative is, for me, Black men care. Black men care about important life outcomes for themselves and others, just like everyone else in this society. We're conducting wellness checks on one another. We're putting together social times where we can maintain our relationships, and we're sharing resources because these are very troubling times. And there are things that some of us are learning that we can share with others. And we're moving these experiences on Zoom and other type platforms. So Black men do care. My other point is Black folks are too race and blame focused. To be clear, I nor any of these other panelists wake up in the morning with the need to remind ourselves that we are Black. It is a daily exposure that reminds us that the rules and opportunities are different for us, that the safeguards in our society may not apply to us, and death can be a result of just a daily routine. So as members of a society that produces evidence, we are compelled to shine light on evidence that makes clear that to others that we have differential treatment. So Black folks aren't too focused on race and blame. It's just that we are the truth tellers and are required to share that perspective and put it in evidence format.
Really appreciate that, Dr. Jackson, because given all the work that you're doing in the We Lab and the shifting that you're doing in the discourse nationally and internationally, your voice is one that has really, really illuminated what we need to do as communities of color. And I appreciate your comments about Black males, and also shining a light on us as center directors and our own positionalities and what that actually means and what we bring to this, not only to this crisis, but to the research. Other scholars, counter narrative.
Ebony, would you like to, or would you like me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. So that's a large question, Fred. I think it's important whenever we're talking about counter narratives that we be clear about the narrative that is being countered. And one of the ways that I think about the counter narrative is through Charles Mill's framework of the racial contract. And in that work, he argued that according to the racial contract, that white is equivalent to human and is equivalent to subject. And in order for that to be enforced, Black has to be the object. It has to be the anti-human. And so when I think historically about organized and individual resistance, I see it as a wholesale rejection of the terms of that contract. That's a way that we can think about, Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, a number of movements throughout the Black radical tradition, as a wholesale rejection of the argument that Black people are anti-human. And there've been all these narratives and all of these policies in order to advance that kind of narrative. There's been the 3/5. There has been stereotypes in terms of Black people as lazy, in terms of Black people as up to no good, Black people as shiftless. And everywhere we've seen the emergence of that narrative, we've also seen organized pushback. And in the Center for Urban Education, we see it as our responsibility to ally a collective push for justice and to ally the vulnerable masses who are thinking about reparations. Another way that I think about counter narratives is actually through Toni Morrison. The Center for Urban Education actually recently honored her with a critical literacy project and a variety of programs in her memory. But when she passed away, a number of people were talking about how her work was important for getting us to decenter a white gaze. And when I think about her work, she really maps for us how to write in such a way that decenters a white gaze, which is to say that we are assuming that Black people are human and are complex, not monolithic, not all exchangeable. And so that's important. And then I think I might just stop there, but I could talk about that for very long time. Thanks for the question. Also, thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here.
That is excellent, Dr. Dance. And your statements and comments are closely aligned with the comments that we got from Dr. James Moore last week and Dr. Luke Wood. They both said, all right, Bonnie, you're starting off with a question about counter narrative. Now, we could talk about that for a whole hour just by itself. And yes. I so appreciate your comments, Dr. Dancy. I mean, the important work that you're doing at the Center for Urban Education and the work that you have historically done to uncover marginalization, particularly among African-American males, and not just men. You do a lot of great work focused on Black women as well. But your points and the work that you're doing is sorely, sorely appreciated.
Thank you, Fred. I'm grateful.
You're welcome.
Okay. So counter narratives. When I think about my own counter narrative, it's a couple of layers to it. So I guess I'll just kind of start with kind of two, if you will. So one is relative to positionality. Some of Dr. Christine Stanley's work in terms of, how the counter narrative meets master narrative. We think about ourselves as Black academics within these historically white spaces. I think is one that really speaks to me in terms of framing what are and have been for decades, if not centuries, not just rhetorical accounts of our experiences individually, collectively, that with resistance and repression, recounting racism in these academic streets with one another, having to legitimize our existence and our research relative to us doing work for by us and centering us, and it not being happenstance or hobby, but rigorous and worthy of consideration. And so I think that when I think of my own counter story, I think of it in that respect, but I also think about it in terms of the intersectionality of counter narratives, particularly when we think about the unique experiences and voices and epistemologies, the perceptions of what Black women bring to the Academy. I don't think it's lost on anyone that this is part 2, and there are 6 of us in the series of invited guests, and there's one Black woman, i.e. me, that is a part of this lineup. I would be remiss to say if I didn't say very openly and plainly that part of our counter narratives as a people are also about how we are reconstructing representation and language relative to the gap, and the fact that me right now is standing in the gap, even within group. You know what I'm saying? Not to mention what we're talking about in terms of what the opportunities are, what the gaps are between groups, let alone just within our own group. And so I think counter narratives also serve as a useful framing and approach for us to think about the construction of who has agency, who has voice, whose story regarding our stories collectively still falls within a very culturally hegemonic patriarchal framing. And so I am my brother's keeper all day, every day. But so too am I my sisters. And so too that when I think about counter narratives, that I don't necessarily want to also perpetuate our personal stories or othering in some regards to what our experiences are, because I think that there are pockets of overshadowing that are still cut from the cloth of a master narrative, even within how we try to amplify our own issues and concerns. And so, that whole binary of male and female too is one that we got to bring critical perspectives in terms of counter narratives around as well. And then lastly, that second piece, I think a significant, for me at least, counter narrative is one about the significance of context, the contextuality in terms of the work we do. And so I've been, 2 decades in of doing work around community colleges. And community colleges have routinely been among the most marginalized of institutions, seeking to serve the most marginalized of society and minoritized. And so I think I have a different kind of counter narrative with respect to having to continually push and assert the placing of value on this sector of education that is the only post-secondary opportunity in some regards for many folks.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. And I so appreciate your voice. We had this conversation very early on. I was talking to Dr. Stella, and I said, you know what? We have all the brother scholars. I said, we need a sister scholar. And I'm going to go to the top, to the notorious EZG, and to make sure that we get her voice and her perspective in there about what the positionality coming from a woman's voice about this work that we're doing, particularly the work that we're doing in and around the crisis that we're confronting. So with that said, Dr. Gallagher, I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Appreciate you moving the narrative on community colleges, and also appreciate the fact that your intersectional focus, it moves beyond, the typical with the 3 of us, Black scholars, African-American scholars. Many times we find that folks think that we're one-trick ponies, that we only can focus on research related to Black and African-American populations, and that is not the case. I look at all of the needle-shifting work that you're doing in and around Hispanic students in STEM in the community college context. So very, very, very important work that you're doing and bringing a focus on our two-year institutions. And I have historically said, you know, all of us have degrees in our training in higher ed administration. And since my doctoral program days, I mean, that's one of my primary courses that I've taught is the community college course. And I've said, you know, historically, we have ignored community colleges. And when you look at enhancing or increasing diversity, then that's where we need to look, because that's where most of us are. But with that said, can I skip down one of the questions that I have, and I think Dr. Gallagher and what you said ties directly into this and it aligns with this question quite well. So the question that I have is, given your positionality, and I actually want the brothers to answer this as well. So given your positionality as an African-American or as a Black woman, does that influence your work in any particular way, how you carry out your work in general and COVID in particular?
Dr. Gallagher, you're muted. There you go.
I didn't realize it was on mute. So yes, in terms of positionality, that does inform the work I do. I think that so much of what we do, you know, this collective that's having a conversation right now, what Dr. Stella is doing, what you all are doing, it reflects self, as it should. And I think for many folks, there's that question whereby, you know, they think, well, maybe I am not part and parcel to this research process, or that, you know, somehow this is me search, right? And somehow that's thought of as anecdotal or not as rigorous. But, you know, I'm just thinking, you know, no research, I don't care what the approach, methodology is exempt, if you will, from having to check your positionality. There is no such thing as, you know, this blanket objectivity. And so, you know, when I think about the kind of work we do, for me in particular, it's hard to come into the space and come into the work, not bringing my whole self. And unapologetically so is I'm gonna you know, frame it as well. And I wanna, you know, make sure that, you know, any, you know, scholars in training that are watching this right now, that they also kind of stand in the fullness of themselves for how they are framing questions, because how they frame the questions, it matters, because it centers and brings us to a place of mattering, right? And so as it relates to COVID, I think, and thinking about my own positionality as well as my own research, you know, passions and expertise relative to the two-year context, I think that there's a lot of interesting things, you know, in terms of the veil being lifted with regard to haves and have-nots and inequities, where, you know, there is a compelling component of institutional diversity within American higher education that is still, again, not quite, you know, getting the attention that it ought to. And again, I'm really kind of speaking to that primary path for underserved and historically underrepresented, racially minoritized folk coming through community colleges. So with COVID, you know, like, you know, our four-year counterparts, the community college sector is also reeling. We're having, you know, to think through what are the equity gaps that were pre-COVID, how are they now exacerbated, and momentum perhaps lost in terms of pathways for students, in terms of getting them, having gotten them on the ramp, but keeping them on the ramp and staying course. You know, there's lots of different resource dependencies and differences in terms of geographically, just like four-year counterparts. And so some of the work we've been and what we've been responding to in the last few weeks since having to navigate this new storm has been particularly, you know, thinking through how the community college, a good chunk of many community colleges in the way of non-credit as well as credit production courses are in CTE and career tech ed and the STEM areas. And this sharp shift, a lot of community colleges were, some were able to pivot. Some weren't able to have those everyday learning environments pivot as quickly because, again, it's a global pandemic. And so while some of us are saying, oh, well, learning has moved online. Okay, learning for some has moved online because it's hit a screeching halt if I'm in a welding program or if I'm in a dental hygienist program. And so there's a lot more questions that we have that are being raised in terms of how everything has been upended and how it in particular with the nuances of community colleges is impacting as well as, again, exacerbating some systemic racialized inequities.
Excellent, excellent. And it's your last statement. Dr. Lewis said last week that he has found that in this age of COVID, we're not really measuring academic potential. We're measuring the acquisition of resources, the haves versus the have-nots. Dr. Dancy and Dr. Jackson, could you respond to that same question? Does your positionality impact what you do in general and how you respond to this COVID crisis in particular?
Well, I guess I can begin. So I listened to your question, Fred, and I think to myself, well, I have no choice. I identify as a Black man, and I think I'm identified in the world as a Black man. And I think that necessitates an analysis of power. In many ways, I think that this conversation is connecting to the one that we just had in terms of the narratives and how that necessitates an analysis of power and analysis of power relationships. So when I think about what it means to be a Black person, particularly, within Western civilization, I think about Du Bois's concept of double consciousness and the ways that daily I confront this engagement of me as really as a displaced African, someone who comes through a legacy of enslavement. But then I want to be in conversation with Ebony's point about the need to focus on gender and patriarchy as essential to any sort of Black solidarity and Black liberation project. So that's why, in my own research and in my own experience, I have tried to pay attention to the ways that gender and patriarchy are global organizers. So I can think about my work with graduate students, whether it's a dissertation or a thesis or a paper. I'm also challenging research designs that focus only on Black boys and Black men without a gender case for doing so, to sort of dislodge us from the assumption that Black people's interests or Black people's needs are only about what Black men's needs are. And that if we are focusing on Black men, that we also have a responsibility to be responsive to gender and patriarchy. And that's where it's very important to be learning from Black feminist theory, to be learning from intersectionality, which I would argue is still the most rigorous theory for helping us to understand power happening across various domains at the same time. So those are commitments and values that I try to bring, because ultimately I think that that's important again for Black solidarity and Black liberation. And another way of thinking about that is to say that, at the end of any kind of survival project or access project, opportunity, freedom, however we're thinking about these end goals, what we don't want to happen is that Black cis men are the only ones who are getting free. What we require is that, Black women, both cis and trans, are free and have the opportunity to live and to be healthy, that Black queer populations also have the opportunity to live and be healthy, because, I would argue that our liberation is really bound up in each other's.
Absolutely, excellent. Dr. Jackson, positionality, impact your work?
Absolutely. No, I mean, no question that positionality informs one's epistemological lens in very important ways. The way I see and understand the world, it certainly impacts the types of questions I ask, my approach, and most importantly, how I interpret and disseminate the results of the data that we collect. And in tandem with the steps necessary to be rewarded in the academy, it generally causes us to take on additional steps to ensure that our work and advocacy gets in the hands of the people that need it the most. And those people are not going to read our academic journals, and those people aren't going to come to our academic conferences to stand in a room and listen to us speak about a small movement and data set that has taken us 5 years. So with that being said, it does require us to focus in ways that connects us to our communities in an important way, because the lived experiences that we bring to these questions that we ask also helps us to understand that the interpretation matters. That interpretation has been very different when you look across the body of research that's been conducted by Black folks on Black people. That lived experience helps you understand why a particular variable was or were not significant, when you can, personalize that experience and not just leave it as a modeled equation. And that's where and why we are important. We are important because the world makes decisions, or at least claims they make decisions based on data. And that we can't just be consumers of those data, we must be producers of those data.
Absolutely.
In addition to producing our own data, we should be in a position to interpret or reinterpret or reanalyze data that others are presenting about our experiences as well. So absolutely, our positionality, or at least, let me say my positionality has impacted the way I've approached the professoriate and certainly the way I approach my academic day.
Excellent, excellent. So panelists, a little introspection here, and I want to hear from you. I want to get your perspective, and I think our audience will really benefit from just hearing, how do you define success? What is success? How do you define success?
Well, I guess I can begin. Okay. So I think success, again, has to be understood in terms of power. So I think there is probably a general agreement that you're working to accomplish or to achieve some aim. What I would argue the problem is with is about how success is defined and measured. And I think within colonized context, within anti-Black context, there is a tendency to measure success in terms of what can be quantified. How much money are you making? How much profit? Can we quantify learning in terms of the quantifiable test score, GPA, for instance, that which can be counted. And the problem with that, it also endorses an individual worldview. It's not contextually concerned with what is in the best interest of the social and the collective. So I think when we think about success, we have to also be thinking about what are our goals in terms of promoting justice, promoting liberation, which would then need to shift our gaze and our thinking toward what is in the best interest of the masses, what is in the best interest of a collective. And that fundamentally changes our measures. And I think part of the challenges that we're having in the academy within educational institutions is that there's this constant struggle between how we think about success and ultimately how we're going to measure for it. So I think that that's a challenge. We also have to be thinking about in what ways do we value or not critical thinking as a form of success. What are our measures? What are our measures for that? I actually would argue that institutions are not in the work of teaching critical thinking, but rather about the production of the workforce that actually is uncritical and is working to produce and help people who own meet their profit aims. But I think that fundamentally is the challenge, that we need to be moving our lens and our thinking about measures away from the technical into the personal in terms of how does learning help us be a better person. So for instance, here I'm thinking about an argument that Afrocentric scholar Marimba Ani has made in terms of the purpose of knowledge, that the purpose of knowledge or the purpose of success is that education or again knowledge is supposed to be internalized in the self and for the collective. It must be internalized in the self and for the collective, not for rank and prestige and not for profit. So we have to be thinking about self-actualization kinds of dimensions. We have to be thinking about critical thinking, and we have to be thinking about what is socially and collectively responsible.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll go because there's a couple of things that Elon said that definitely resonate, and we're cut from the same regards with this. And I think to his point about the collective, I often tell my staff, Ubuntu, right? I am because we are, and so it's very organic for me, for us. And when I say us, I mean more broadly even, because of the company we're keeping here. But we are cut from that cloth of, when I shine, you shine, right? Shine. There's enough light for everybody. So when I think about success, me personally, it does go back to the collective. It's about having a sense of purpose, and aim that is beyond just the self, right? And so certainly we all have accomplishments that we want to make in terms of individually. But again, kind of like some of Triandis's work about individualistic and collectivist cultures. As a culture, we have a collectivist nature. And so for me, again, it's just kind of second nature. It's a default to kind of think about success as something that is a desired aim or trying to walk in my purpose for the purpose of lifting as I climb.
Excellent. Excellent.
For me, professionally, I have two simple metrics, and I want to accentuate professionally. One is, did I create opportunities? And two, is this place better than I left it? For most of us, we have or will be the first in our institutions doing many roles. And for me, the more important aspect of that equation is, are you the last? It's the institution's fault that you may have been the first, but you play a role in whether you are the last. And then secondly, we spend a lot of time in these organizations learning the rules of engagement, doing our work. And the question becomes, as we move into important roles where we have an opportunity to make decisions, do we make them? Are we making decisions? Are we playing important roles that when you leave that place, whether retirement or for whatever reason, is it better because you were there? Those are the only two metrics for me as it relates to success. The rest of those items, I think, are kind of personally attributable. But these other two is, did I make a difference that should be able to live beyond me?
Excellent, excellent. And I would just quickly say for me, Dr. Jackson, I so in line with what you're saying, because being part and parcel to the Southern Baptist Black Church, there's an old gospel tune that talks about how your living is not in vain if you've helped someone as you moved along the way. And my definition of success is much like all of you have said, in some type of way of how do I help elevate the masses to have an equitable chance at achieving their dream, at whatever that dream is. And although I don't necessarily think that we have, and you've all alluded to this, a common metric. I spend a lot of time when I teach the higher education governance class. We spend the first 3 weeks talking about, I just throw it out to the class. I was like, so what does it mean to be an educated person? And we tossed that back and forth for 3 weeks. And I said, you see here, I said, it's hard to come up with a common metric because all of you have a different idea about what it means to be an educated person. Some of you say that it's getting the degree. Some of you say it's getting a 6-figure job. Some of you saying it's just, being able to complete your classes. Well, I think that's the very same thing that we see about success, in that everybody has a different metric, a different idea of what success is. But what I want to be able to do is be a conduit to take the people, to take the masses to a place where they can drink from the fount and discover success for whatever it is and whatever it means to them individually, collectively and individually. So the next question is, we have a lot of people out there, teachers, administrators, parents, students, from Chicago to Wisconsin, from Pittsburgh to Houston, Texas, and all points in between. So I want to kind of narrow this discussion into focusing on what should we be thinking about? What should these folks be thinking about in relation to ensuring educational success in this time of COVID from the P-12 perspective? And I say P-12 first because I'm going to have you to think about what it means from a higher ed perspective in the next question. But this question, how do we define success? How do we model success in this COVID era in the P-12 context? Teachers, parents, administrators, however you want to position your discussion.
I have some perspectives, and one from a personal perspective, one from professional. But personally, recognizing that we're in very difficult times, that we are a part of an industry where our core function, which is teaching, does not generally generate income. Unfortunately, what that means is we'll be asked to do even more with even less. And that we can rise to this occasion. So keeping our morale up during these times will be very important, because we will experience a financial squeeze that's going to be uncomfortable. So going into that, personally recognizing that. Professionally, these are times that require professional growth and innovation. If
Yes.
Online instruction and virtual work platforms are your weak point, you must begin focusing now on making them your strong point.
Sure.
They will play a critical role in our lives until this world can appropriately address the pandemic. It's going to be very difficult to think that we're going to easily transition back into working, learning, and teaching in the ways we did pre-COVID-19. Therefore, those two critical aspects, if they're not a part of your professional toolkit, they need to be, because as I mentioned in the first point of order, there's going to be a financial squeeze, and we want to be essential, we want to be ready, and we want to be available.
Excellent.
So I guess I can go next, Fred. So as I think about your question, I'm thinking about, I think, points that were made even in the first dialogue that you hosted about COVID as exacerbating existing oppressions. For sure, I think we're seeing that the ways that power arrangements are being surfaced. And what I would also add is also accelerated, right? The way that like death and illness outcomes are being accelerated, and the disproportionate impact that Black communities and communities of color are having because of historical and contemporaneous injustice and systemic oppression. So I think that's very important when we think about the P12 context to understand exactly what is new and what is already existing, but being accelerated, being exacerbated, being surfaced. So even in the context of COVID, for instance, we still have to grapple with why, over 80% of the teaching workforce is white. I live in a state where it's at least 90%. And, the experiences that we know are occurring to students who are living in urban or urbanized areas. We have to be thinking not only about who is teaching in our communities, but what are they teaching, which I think is in conversation with the last question you asked in terms of what are we still being asked to accept as the true history of this country, the true history of humanity, of citizenship that troubles courses like history, what's being offered to us in terms of the STEM fields, in terms of the appropriate ways to teach someone. Are we using still individualistic approaches? Are we using collective approaches? Who are we also seeing or not seeing as pedagogical experts or as curriculum informers? When we begin to ask ourselves that question, we have to also think about those who have been dispossessed by schools, families, parents. So as we react to COVID in our policies, what are the choices that are being offered to families and communities in the education of their children? And I'll come back to that point in a moment. It's also important to think about food insecurity. So I was reading some recent data that 20% of American households are hungry. And we know that Black people and people of color are disproportionately affected there. So I think that schools have to organize themselves to continue to pay attention to nutrition, that we have to continue to support communities with food, period stop. We have to think critically about what's often framed as a hierarchy of needs, and maybe ask ourselves, is hierarchy the right way to think about it? So I've been concerned by some school moves to remove counseling services. And this is not just a blanket acceptance of counseling services as non-biased. I mean, for sure, there are bias that occurs across these, and that's work that has to be done. But where counseling services are needed, necessary supports for students, we have to think really carefully and critically about eliminating them, because we think we're focusing on something more important. What the pandemic is also doing is stressing us out. We are trying to survive. People are sick all around us. Testing is not widespread. A vaccine is not discovered. And then there is scary conversation about whether or not schools will actually be back in the fall. So this is all very stressful. And I think we have to think very carefully about eliminating psychological services. We have to watch our deficit frames. And I think that this is in conversation with the question that you asked about counter narratives and master narratives. So I'm already beginning to see frames around students who live in poor areas and Black areas as hard to reach students. And I think we have to be careful about understanding students as subjectively hard to reach because of the kinds of practices that attend those framings. I think we have to watch our logics of punishment that may occur during COVID, which can show up language as recovery or credit recovery that can actually burden students. So to say, you didn't complete you didn't complete your coursework. And so you'll need to attend some sort of summer school. You'll need to backtrack. You'll need to do additional work. We'll have to think about students who are working, not, some students, if you think about high school ages, are working, their families are depending on them. So does this actually burden them? And can we shift our focus more on institutional and systemic responsibility and less on the individual student? That would, require a deep grappling with, the question, why am I asking students to accept the burden for something that the institution itself was not prepared for? And I'm recalling a conversation with a good friend where we were having that conversation. I think finally I would offer that technology interventions do not remedy systemic causes. So just because students might get access to a laptop or just because students might have access to Wi-Fi still doesn't mean there aren't deep and abiding systemic issues that that challenge learning in this context. And so what that requires is still a focus on what researchers have been calling attention to before the pandemic in terms of who is teaching our children, what is being taught, and also are we willing to shift away from individual deficit frames into what is the responsibility of professionals? What are the possibilities, for instance, for teaching interventions to help students recover from COVID? That's a very different question than asking, how can students meet the standard?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I guess what I'll add and be brief looking at where we are in terms of time is we are seeing some of the same patterns play out in Illinois that of course are happening countrywide. There was already a gap. And so those that have been prepared to do remote learning, we do see income divide in terms of the distribution of income, where those families that are in the top, 1/5, of course, are robustly, 9 out of 10 of them have preparedness in that, they can take advantage of Zoom and other online resources and have infrastructure in place. And we also see pockets in terms of with Illinois and trying to map some of the inequities around where the resources or lack thereof are. In certain communities, there, of course, is not the necessary technology resources to have distance education, and not to mention just for the students, but for some of the faculties within K-12. I know for just my daughters, we live in the middle of some corn, and a couple of the teachers have really spotty, connections. There are lots of different issues, but beyond that, again, it's the same kind of historical patterns that are just reemergent, where we see the most deprived areas in terms of, in Illinois in particular, some of our rural communities, as well as, the urban centers that have, the bulk of those households have fewer resources. And so, but regardless of income, still, folk of color, students of color, for example, have, been the ones that have had the most challenges.
Excellent. And I would just say for me very quickly, as I speak to our P-12 audience, I've actually been kind of thinking through P-12 implications, and I'll have to hit up my good friends at Diverse, my good friend Jamal Watson, really soon, because I'm thinking of this op-ed piece that I want to write. We talk so much about the importance of social distancing, but when I think about the population I study, primarily looking at young African-American males, young Black males who are gifted and talented, and the problems that we have there. When I look at the experiences of Black males and even Black females in the P-12 context, we need to think about emotional distancing, because there are so many issues that Black males have historically, particularly those who are attempting to traverse the waters of gifted and talented, that lead to their diminution of their emotional intelligence. The whole notion of disidentification. I mean, not wanting to show their gifts and talents because of, perceptions, not only by their peers, but by adults as well. Stereotype threat, Dr. Dancy talked about that before. This whole notion of survival conflict. What does it mean for me to be a gifted and talented African-American male, Black female, who my gifts and talents actually remove me or take me away or take me out of the neighborhood, out of the hood. And they take me on to Princeton or to Harvard or to some of these places, but my family is still back at home struggling. So that's an emotional issue. So emotional distancing, how do we create pathways for emotional distancing with that? And the whole notion, all of this is wrapped up into this idea of deficit thinking. How do we disrupt the narrative of deficit thinking? How do we create emotional distancing from deficit thinking, deficit models, deficit mindsets that impact not only P12, I would say P20 across the board? The deficit mindset is one of the most pervasive and most vitriolic issues impacting our students of color, Black, brown, male, female, all points in between. In our waning minutes, I think we have 4. So can my brilliant colleagues share with me very quickly, give me your top 3 things. What are the top 3 things that this COVID pandemic has taught you?
I'm going to say one thing. I'm not going to say 3 things because I'm scared that we'll lose the tie. But what is insidious is the way that people are demonstrating that their understanding of freedom is individualist and not collective. And I think COVID is teaching us that. So for every organized defiance that is cloaking itself in the aesthetic of protest, but it's really about individual leisure, consumption, about profit, and I think even deeply a willingness to die for these logics that are fundamentally, anti-Black, patriarchal, capitalist, is teaching us in this moment about what the contract of life is within a colonial state. And if we think about many historical texts about freedom, inherent in the notion of freedom was this idea that you cannot be free at the expense of someone else's freedom. That's how it should be. So that freedom is fundamentally, or should be, a collectivist kind of condition. But I think we're seeing the ways that people are underscoring, arguing, forcing us to think about freedom as an individualistic kind of endeavor, and that's what we have to continue to refuse. I mean, it's coming out in the collective refusal to physically distance. It's coming out in the collective refusal to wear masks. And what I'm most concerned about in that kind of scenario is that people who are most likely to dedicate themselves to that kind of behavior might be most likely to get access to healthcare resources, where those populations that are at the core of the concern in the Center for Urban Education at Pitt would be less likely to get those, right? Because that's the way that we experience life within systems of oppression. So that's been really unfortunate, and we have to disrupt that.
Excellent. Dr. Gallagher, any 1, 2, or 3 things?
Well, I don't have to give 3 necessarily. I'll just kind of wrap them together in one little overview. And I think for me, the takeaway, and similar to what Elon has, been perceiving, been picking up, is, again, it goes back to the fact that there's this individualism. So there's a lot of competitive self-interest at work, as opposed to cooperative group interest at play. And, one of the things that I think is very telling is that in the midst of, us having stay-at-home orders, that swept across the country, you know, as we've seen the data come back, because in the early weeks, right, we just had no idea of, you know, who is it that's being affected primarily. And once we saw that it was by and large Black folks from the cases of positive COVID, and particularly the fatalities of those that are dying from COVID, again, being primarily Black as well as brown folk, I think that that's when it also just reinvigorated this American individualism and you know, competitive self-interest of, oh, don't shelter in place. You know, we open for business. Let's open the country up, because we can open the country up given who we see is dying. And since largely it's the others, Black folk, brown folk, then you know, business can be open. And so this whole notion about, you know, essential workers, I think is one that has really been in the eyes of some reserved for physicians and nurses and you know, maybe respiratory therapists on occasion when they enter the conversation, but you know, allied health professionals. But it is also a play on words that we have a war and we need you. You're on the front line. And so, yeah, we need to give shout outs and love for our custodians and our bus drivers. And again, folks who in the service industry are by and large poor folk, Black folk, brown folk. But let's keep it plain. We have an administration, I think, in DC, whereby they don't necessarily see us as essential. They see us as disposable. Hence, open the country up. Business is good, and we're open for business. That's what I've taken away from this.
Wow. Dr. Jackson?
Between essentialism and being essential and being disposable.
Absolutely. Absolutely,
yeah,
Dr. Geller.
We're you know, having some conversations about the nuances and the play on framing and reframing. And so let's not get duped with what this really is.
Excellent, absolutely. I think we are 2 minutes over. So Dr. Jackson, would you like to have a final word and we'll just close it out?
Sure, thank you. Real quickly, I learned education institutions can move quickly in spite of our past beliefs. We took instruction online in less than 2 weeks and put people in remote work access in that same time frame. And then lastly, COVID-19 has accelerated workplace neglect. I won't go into detail, but the neglect that was in place pre-COVID is certainly accelerated. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this panel.
Excellent. Thank you, Doc. So to my brilliant, gifted Black colleagues, center directors, I so appreciate y'all. This has been a wonderful, wonderful forum. So to be continued. I appreciate you. And we will, there should be several comments that come through. So we'll make sure that we get those out to you and give you an idea about the number of people that logged on and all that good stuff. But in the meantime, in between time, y'all stay safe and stay Black. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.